These kind of events are a fiasco to me. This is idiots taking themselves far too serious.
Rock against the rich. These are all Joe Strummer worlds, you know. I've moved on, but a lot of the foolish haven't, and they're still stuck there. And that explains Green Day. You know, there's a band that haven't come up with anything of their own. What they literally are is a coat hanger with a studded leather jacket stuck on it. All right? And I think it's a parody and it's a shame.
John Lydon's disdain for certain musical acts wasn't merely a punk posturing, it was, in many cases, a deeply held philosophical objection to what he perceived as a lack of authenticity, a betrayal of the working class, or simply a profound boredom.
I don't have to explain myself to anybody and I ain't going to really bother. Now, I was asked here, right, to interview with the band here, Pill, but now, like, we're facing a cheapskate comedy interrogation act.
The legend of the I Hate Pink Floyd t-shirt, a cornerstone of Sex Pistols lore, has often been misinterpreted.
At that time, you couldn't have been more disgusting and pissed people off in such a way than to do something like that, because nobody thought of criticising something as sacrosanct as Pink Floyd.
It wasn't, as Lydon would later patiently explain, a genuine animosity towards the band's music in its entirety. The truth was far more nuanced, more strategic, and ultimately more revealing of Lydon's complex relationship with the rock establishment.
It was a very, very squalid period, massive unemployment, absolutely no hope, class warfare rampant, quite literally no future.
In his autobiography, Lydon recounted the infamous audition with Malcolm McLaren and Bernie Rhodes. "I wore a t-shirt that had 'I Hate Pink Floyd' written on it," he recalled. "It was a deliberate provocation. I wanted to see if they were genuine or just another bunch of hippies. Pink Floyd, to me, represented everything that was stale and pompous about rock music at that time. They were massive, untouchable, and frankly, a bit dull." The provocation worked. McLaren was intrigued, seeing in Lydon a raw, untamed energy that could be harnessed to shatter the prevailing musical landscape. But the hatred, he would clarify repeatedly in subsequent interviews, was aimed squarely at their self-indulgent, stadium-filling excesses, not at the early, more experimental work with Syd Barrett. Syd was brilliant, Lydon told Mojo magazine in an interview published in January 2016. He was a true eccentric, an original. It was after he left that they became what they became, pompous, prog rock bores. The very act of wearing that t-shirt was a declaration of war, not just on Pink Floyd, but on an entire generation of rock stars who had, in Lydon's view, lost touch with their roots, their audience, and any semblance of danger.
I mean, they were the royal family of music.
This broader resentment extended to many of the luminaries of the so-called British invasion. Bands like the Rolling Stones, The Who, and The Animals, while revered by critics and fans alike, were, to Lydon, nothing more than pale imitations. "They were piss poor, weren't they?" he scoffed in a December 2014 interview with The Guardian. "Just cheap copies of black American blues music played very badly." His contempt stemmed from a belief that these bands, largely comprised of middle-class white men, had no genuine connection to the suffering and struggle that gave birth to the blues. They lacked the empathy and the grueling existence that black people had to endure to truly play the blues, he asserted in his autobiography. It was appropriation, pure and simple. They put white faces on black music, played very badly, and then got all the credit. For Lydon, the very ideology of the British invasion was a sham, a cultural theft devoid of true feeling. He saw them as part of the same problem as later, more bloated rock bands, a comfortable, privileged elite performing a watered-down version of authentic music for an equally comfortable audience. This widespread disillusionment with the established rock order would directly fuel his desire to create something entirely new and disruptive. Joe Strummer, the charismatic frontman of The Clash, often presented himself as a voice of the working class, a figure deeply entrenched in the political struggles of the time. Yet for Lydon, this portrayal was, at best, disingenuous, and at worst, a cynical act of exploitation. In his autobiography, Lydon pulled no punches when discussing Strummer. "Joe Strummer," he wrote, "he was trying to be the working class hero, wasn't he? But he wasn't. He came from a privileged background, went to public school. Lydon saw Strummer's adoption of a working-class persona as a calculated move, a way to connect with an audience he didn't truly belong to. He exploited working-class issues by pretending to be working class, Lydon charged in a 2010 interview with The Independent. He didn't have first-hand experience with the struggle, he was a fake. This wasn't merely a matter of differing class backgrounds, it was, for Lydon, a fundamental breach of integrity. He believed that to speak for a community, one had to genuinely be of that community, to have lived its hardships and understood its nuanced realities. Strummer's perceived inauthenticity, his slumming it for artistic credibility, was anathema to Lydon's fiercely held beliefs about honesty and representation in music. The notion that someone could simply adopt a punk image or a working-class voice without the lived experience was a deep source of irritation for Lydon, whose own background was one of genuine poverty and hardship. This same principle of authenticity, or lack thereof, extended to his condemnation of Billy Idol's post-Sex Pistols collaborations. When Billy Idol joined former Sex Pistols members Steve Jones and Paul Cook in the Generation Sex project, Lydon saw it as a desperate, uninspired cash-in, a grotesque parody of what the Sex Pistols once stood for. "It's a clown circus," Lydon fumed in an interview with NME in March 2023, his voice dripping with contempt. "It's pathetic. Billy Idol doing it? Come on." For Lydon, the Sex Pistols were a singular incendiary force, a moment in time that could not and should not be replicated or diluted by those who weren't integral to its original creation. Idol, while a contemporary from the early punk scene, was not a founding member, and his involvement in a project that traded on the Sex Pistols' legacy felt to Lydon like a cheap imitation, a further stain on the band's already complex history. The idea of revisiting the past, particularly without his involvement and with someone he viewed as an outsider, was an affront to his artistic and personal principles. This perceived betrayal by Idol, and by extension his former bandmates, would exacerbate the already strained relationships within the original Sex Pistols lineup. The relationship between John Lydon and his former Sex Pistols bandmates, Steve Jones and Paul Cook, has been a turbulent, often acrimonious one for decades, punctuated by legal battles, public slanging matches, and bitter accusations.
They sue me for not giving them permission, but I didn't actually deny permission, I merely asked a question.
The release of the Danny Boyle-directed series Pistol, based on Steve Jones's memoir Lonely Boy, brought their long-simmering animosity to a boiling point. Lydon was vehemently opposed to the series, viewing it as a gross misrepresentation of the band's history and a cynical attempt to profit from their legacy without his input or consent. "It's a travesty," Lydon declared in a furious interview with the Sunday Times in April 2022. "They're trying to cash in on my life, my words, my songs, and I'm not having it." He went further, accusing Jones and Cook of being motivated purely by greed. "They're greedy, selfish, nasty f***s," he spat in the same interview, trying to make a quick buck off the back of something I created.
First time I heard about this was January the 4th, 21. Was an email from their manager saying that they wanted me to agree to the publishing rights, which we naturally asked for what?
Yeah.
And then on the 8th of January, in came another email from Danny Boyle saying he'd taken on the project, but it was short on detail. Can we see the script? What is this about? All of this was denied.
And you didn't get a script or anything?
Nothing, and still to this day, I don't have a clue what they're doing here. Of course I'm upset with that. I'm the man what wrote those songs, right? I gave them their image, I gave them everything. And they've done this rather snidey kind of piece of work behind my back.
The dispute escalated into a high court battle over the use of Sex Pistols music in the series, with Lydon ultimately losing. He argued that the use of songs required unanimous consent under a long-standing band agreement, while Jones and Cook maintained a majority decision was sufficient. His defeat in court only intensified his bitterness, reinforcing his belief that he was being unfairly treated and exploited by those he had once shared a stage with.
They say,
Who wrote that for them?
we reiterate, he was informed of the Pistol TV series,
Liars.
offered meetings
Liars.
as director,
Filthy
and to
liars.
be involved.
Lydon's accusations went beyond mere artistic differences or disagreements over royalties. He felt personally betrayed, as if his former bandmates were not only distorting the narrative of the Sex Pistols, but also attempting to erase his central role in its creation and impact. This sense of betrayal was particularly acute given the timing of some of their alleged actions. He accused them of trying to cash in on the death of Queen Elizabeth II by, in his view, exploiting the band's iconic anti-monarchy anthem, God Save the Queen. The Sex Pistols were God Save the Queen, Lydon stated in an interview with Piers Morgan on Talk TV in June 2022, emphasising his ownership of that particular narrative. And now the Queen's died, and they're doing their best to cash in on it. He saw their actions as opportunistic and disrespectful, not just to him, but to the very spirit of rebellion that defined the Sex Pistols. For Lydon, the band was a powerful, transformative force, and any attempt to commodify or sanitize its history, particularly without his involvement, was an act of desecration. This ongoing rancor with his former bandmates underscored his deeply held belief that authenticity and artistic control were paramount, and that any compromise on these fronts was an unforgivable sin. The intense personal and legal battles over the Sex Pistols' legacy would set a precedent for Lydon's future confrontations with those he felt were misrepresenting or exploiting cultural movements, preparing the ground for his vehement opposition to acts like Kneecap. The public spat between John Lydon and Kneecap erupted in early 2024, revealing Lydon's continuing willingness to confront artists he perceives as betraying a certain ethos. Kneecap, a Belfast-based group known for their Irish-language rap and anti-establishment lyrics, had made comparisons between themselves and the Sex Pistols, aligning their confrontational style with the punk pioneers.
Got a little peak one day, made me feel like I was 7. I know it exists, but I can't stop getting pissed. One more thing I'll be adding to the list.
This comparison, rather than being seen as a compliment, infuriated Lydon. "I absolutely loathe them," Lydon declared in a scathing interview with the Irish Times in January 2024. "They are the enemy. They're jumping on the bandwagon and pretending to be something they're not."
Maybe they need bloody good kneecapping.
Oh, well,
There have been festivals
the irony.
withdrawing them.
His ire seemed to be rooted in a familiar complaint, what he saw as a lack of originality and an opportunistic attempt to leverage the Sex Pistols' image for their own gain. While Kneecap's political stances, their advocacy for the Irish language and their critique of British rule might superficially align with punk's anti-authoritarian spirit, Lydon saw through it, or so he claimed. For Lydon, the Sex Pistols were a unique phenomenon, born of specific socio-economic conditions in 70s Britain, and any attempt to replicate that or draw direct parallels felt to him like a cheap imitation. Lydon's criticism of Kneecap also seemed to touch upon a deeper, more personal nerve: the perceived hypocrisy of using punk as a template for a different political agenda, particularly one that might be seen as nationalistic. While the Sex Pistols were fiercely anti-establishment, Lydon has always maintained that their rebellion was against a system, not against a specific nationality, and that their message was universal. He has always distanced himself from any form of narrow nationalism, seeing it as inherently divisive. He stated in the same Irish Times interview, "I will not have any country's flag used as a badge for prejudice and propaganda." His condemnation of Kneecap, therefore, was not merely about musical taste, but about what he saw as a distortion of the punk spirit he helped create. He believes that true rebellion comes from a place of genuine, unfiltered anger, and not from a calculated political stance. Kneecap's overtly political and nationalistic messaging, combined with their self-comparison to the Sex Pistols, likely struck Lydon as both unoriginal and a misappropriation of the punk legacy. This strong reaction to Kneecap underscores Lydon's rigid view of what constitutes authentic protest and his intolerance for what he deems to be derivative or politically motivated opportunism. This unwavering commitment to what he considers musical and ideological purity inevitably shapes his condemnation of modern technological advancements in music production. For John Lydon, the live musical experience is sacrosanct, a raw, unvarnished exchange between artist and audience. Any technological intervention that diminishes this perceived authenticity is met with utter contempt. His disdain for autotune and backing tracks is not merely a preference for analog over digital, it is a moral objection to what he considers a fundamental dishonesty in performance. "It's utter disgust I have for singers who use autotune or some kind of forgery," Lydon declared unequivocally in an interview with The Big Issue in February 2024. "It's not just cheating the audience, it's cheating yourself. It's an admission that you're not good enough." This sentiment stems from his punk ethos, where raw energy, imperfection, and direct engagement were paramount. The idea that a performer would rely on a machine to correct their voice or pre-recorded elements to fill out their sound strikes him as an abomination, a betrayal of the very concept of live music. Lydon's abhorrence extends to the broader implications of these technologies. He views them as contributing to a culture of complacency and mediocrity, where genuine talent is no longer a prerequisite for success. In his view, these tools allow artists to present a polished, flawless product that bears little resemblance to their actual abilities. This, he argues, is deeply misleading to the audience. "If you can't sing it, don't sing it," he stated bluntly in the same Big Issue interview. "It's as simple as that. Learn your craft, practice, and if you're not up to it, find something else to do." His perspective is rooted in a working-class ethic of hard graft and genuine skill. The use of technological crutches is seen as an easy way out, a form of intellectual laziness that undermines the integrity of the art form itself. For Lydon, the vulnerability and potential for error in a live performance are what make it truly compelling and human. To remove that, to create a sterile, machine-perfect sound, is to strip the music of its soul. This unwavering commitment to raw, unadulterated performance encapsulates Lydon's broader philosophy of authenticity, which has been a consistent thread throughout his career and a driving force behind his criticisms of countless musical acts and trends.